the virtue tradition. He's an ordained pastor in the ELCA, frequently speaks in congregational settings and groups of pastors, which is where I've had a wonderful opportunity to learn a lot from him. And it was his work on virtue ethics to a group of pastors that first got me wondering about having this conversation this weekend. Dr. Bateza is also the chair of the ELCA's task force for a new social statement on faith and civic life. And if you know anything about the social statement processes in the ELCA, you know that's a very big task to be chair of such a task force. So we're grateful for your work in that. Lives in Northfield with his wife, Cynthia, and they have 2 kids, Austin and Magdalene, and a dog. And our second guest, Jonathan Zasloff, is professor of law at UCLA School of Law. He teaches classes on property, land use, and Talmud, but not all at the same time. He has his PhD in American history from Harvard, his JD from Yale Law School, and is an ordained rabbi. He writes on Jewish ethics, the Talmud, and the prophetic tradition, and he's currently working on a commentary about the Pirkei Avot, which you will hear more about in this session if you don't know what that is. We're about to learn. Jonathan grew up and still lives in Los Angeles with his wife and daughter and 2 dogs. I think dogs and theological degrees are like the connecting thing among many of us in this room. Jonathan follows baseball and politics with almost equal passion, and in his spare time, this is his sabbatical year. He is also serving as a hospital chaplain at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. So we're really delighted to have you both here, and I'll let them take it away. You are now on.
Okay.
Yes.
There we go. All right. Good morning again, everyone. Good morning. We're going to do some quick introductions before we do that. I think we both want to say thank you to the congregation, to Pam, to Maggie Odell, one of the main organizers, instigators, herders of us and our various topics and ideas and conversations. So thanks to everybody whose time and talents made this possible. We're both excited to be here. Yes. And to know that this is part 1 of a 3-part moving feast of conversations. I feel like we dropped the opportunity to make some really great puns about a professor and a lawyer walk into a bar, or a pastor and a rabbi walk into a bar. But all of this will culminate in a bar tomorrow night after good conversation here this morning and again this afternoon. So, introduce yourself.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Maybe the only other thing I would add, I just got to be careful about this, is the other thing that's been my passion over the last several months is working on Habitat for Humanity projects. So I'm learning how to be a carpenter, and somebody said, "Wait, a rabbi and a carpenter? Are you looking for a promotion?" I was like, no, that's not where I was going with that. But there you go.
Good call. All right, so today's going to be a little bit quick this morning, but this morning our effort is to sort of introduce some of the major topics that we think about and that motivate a lot of our reflection and research, thinking about questions of virtue, questions of character, and particularly we're going to look at a couple of texts to help us center that conversation and that reflection. And so you'll see all of that. But first off, I'm going to do the quick and dirty summary of ethics in like 5 slides. So see how that goes. It's been my experience that everybody, when you say the word ethics, knows what you mean, even though everybody has a different understanding of what that means. If you say somebody is ethical or unethical, you get a pretty quick, immediate sense of what's being said about that person. Something about their character, their quality, what to expect, past actions or future actions. For my purposes, I like to think about ethics as reflection on human action in the ways that it goes well or poorly, better or worse. The idea is that we're the kind of creatures that engage in all kinds of actions. Some of the things we do aren't things that we do with any sense of deliberation or intention. One example some people give is like scratching your beard, because it was normally men giving these examples. And if somebody says, "Why are you scratching your beard?" you would say, "Well, I don't know, I just wasn't even thinking about it." Right? Or you're walking along, daydreaming, and completely blanked out. But oftentimes we can actually respond to questions about what we're doing, Somebody says, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Right? And that we know that they're expecting answers from us of some kind. And those answers are usually asking us both to describe what we're doing and often kind of evaluate its goodness or badness, its going well or going poorly. In our religious context, as Christians and Jews, we often index or connect these to questions about God, questions about God's creation, and our role within God's creation. So, just to be forewarned, I use the words ethics and morals interchangeably. Some folks distinguish them, but that gives you a general picture where we're coming from. So, when you learn about ethics in sort of an undergraduate class at a great institution, be it in LA or here in Northfield, you usually get introduced to sort of a typology, some categories to distinguish different ways of approaching questions about ethics. And the three biggies, the three large families are up here on the screen for us. On one side we have, good, it's big enough. You can see that okay? One always guesses about how big the screen will be when you're presenting. On one side here we have deontology, which is a fancy way to talk about duties. And the thinker people associate with this is a guy named Immanuel Kant, who you don't need to know. There will be no quizzes. But somebody who comes at ethics from the perspective of deontology is going to ask about what our duty is. And often will refer to those duties by talking about principles or laws, et cetera, et cetera. There are certain things that must be done, that must not be done, that are required, permitted, prohibited, all of that kind of language. Next to them, we have a group of folks who belong to a school called consequentialism. And these folks are less concerned with questions about duty and more concerned about questions about impact or effect or consequences. Think greatest good for the greatest number. How is this going to help the most people? How is this going to increase goodness or happiness or whatever the thing you're looking for in the world to the greatest amount? And so this often is described as a very American sort of way to look at things. Sometimes as a very sort of political or economic way to look at things, maximizing profit and minimizing expenses, all that kind of stuff. And so people can approach this in different ways. Sometimes people have rules, sometimes they have other ways of framing this, but that's sort of a general family of ideas. For us here today, we're going to be talking about virtue as a different school or a different approach. And folks who are interested in virtue aren't thinking so much just about duties or about outcomes, but the focus is primarily on character, sort of the goodness of a person's will, their orientation, their disposition to act in certain ways and not act in other ways. So somebody interested in virtue is going to ask, what does it mean to have a good life or to have a life well lived? Something the ancient Greeks would refer to as eudaimonia, or good-spirited or good-souled people. What is it going to mean to have a life that's flourishing? So flourishing isn't just sort of fulfilling your duties or maximizing outputs and impacts. It's about living the right kind of life in the right kind of way. It's more of a holistic approach, I would say. And key figures here are folks like Aristotle, Aquinas, and maybe the rabbis and Jesus and other carpenters. So when a person's interested in virtue, they usually will give you some kind of list or some kind of catalog. These are the kinds of character traits that we want to lift up or celebrate. One common way to do this is to break it into things like intellectual, moral, or theological virtues. This is sort of Thomas Aquinas' way of breaking things up. Intellectual virtues are kind of things that make you think better. The trick about these is sometimes they can be used for good or for ill. Some people are very knowledgeable and very skilled and very evil. And so those might be good ways of thinking, executing your thoughts, but necessarily not good ways of being. So usually folks like Thomas are talking more about moral virtues and then theological virtues as well. Moral virtues primarily concern our lives with one another, kind of here on this earth and this plane. And theological are focused primarily on our life with God, or God and neighbor, respectively. You'll recognize a lot of these words, hopefully. Justice, courage. Temperance doesn't get a whole lot of focus. Got a bad name because the folks who didn't like alcohol kind of ruined it for all of us. in multiple ways. So anyway, the temperance folks are able to sort of control their passions that are pulling them in different directions. And then, of course, faith, hope, and love are Pauline references or biblical references. And you see all these words, again, scattered throughout scriptures and all kinds of places. Things aren't quite this simple. I've given you sort of 3 schools and different focuses, different foci. But if we dig deeper, virtue folks talk about duties and outcomes. Consequentialists sometimes talk about things that aren't allowed to be done, certain rules that you can't violate. Deontologists are sometimes concerned that their actions actually have an impact in the world, and so it all gets kind of swirled up. And for Lutherans, it gets even more swirled up. Martin Luther once wrote, "We do not become righteous by doing righteous deeds, but having been made righteous, we do righteous deed." Virtually the entire ethics of Aristotle is the worst enemy of grace.
Tell us what you're really saying here, Martin.
Exactly. This is his polished version. In his less polished version, he's a damned heathen and a rascal and a scoundrel. So, you know, mixed audience, wanted to be careful with the words of Luther that I quoted. Okay, so that gives you a setup. Now let's take a deeper dive into some texts, and I'll turn over to my colleague.
Okay, so
Do you want to?
well, can I just press this if I want to move forward?
You can, or you can give me the clicker,
Okay,
or I can click
okay,
for you.
all right. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just introduce you to an important text that, at least in my view, forms the basis of Jewish ethical thinking, particularly through virtue ethics. Now, you should be aware, disclaimer at the beginning, the basic rule is 2 Jews, 3 opinions, all right? And I was saying this to Anthony yesterday, is a great story about this, that people in a synagogue are going back and forth. Are you supposed to stand for the Shema, for the central prayer in the liturgy? Or are you supposed to sit down for it? And they argue, go back and forth and back and forth, and finally says somebody, why don't we go find Jaime Rabinowitz in the nursing home, because he's 99 years old and he'll know the way that you're supposed to do it. So they all go over to him and they find him, and he's sitting there kind of glassy-eyed, and they say, Jaime, are we supposed to stand for the Shema? And he sits there and says, that is not the tradition. Oh, so we're supposed to sit for the Shema? That is not the tradition. But Jaime, if that's the case, then all we're going to do is sit there and yell and scream at each other and argue all the time. That is the tradition, right? So just keep in mind the important disclaimer. Okay, so Pirkei Avot, which is a text that I work with a lot, and you can see, Will Schroer has often told me that the problem with doing PowerPoint is you can't read off of it. You should assume that your audience is literate. But Avot is a section of the Mishnah which is the central text of rabbinic Judaism. This is sometimes a surprise when I say that in some senses Judaism is not a biblical religion. It's a religion based on the subsequent interpretations. In the context of the period of antiquity, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It was this horrible catastrophe for the Jewish people. And about 200 years later, documents began to appear that were argued were the writing down of the oral law. Judaism obviously has the written law. We read it in the 5 books of Moses all the time. But there were also a group of people who became very dominant who said that there is also an oral law. These people were called Pharisees, by the way. We like them. They don't have a very good reputation in the New Testament. We can discuss that. But that there was also an oral law that was also handed to Moses. And it was decided around 200 CE to start writing this down as a way of putting together the oral law that you weren't supposed to write down. And Avot it's a pretty, well, actually, let me go back here. It's a pretty laconic text. It's not very long. You can read it, the whole thing in about 25 minutes. It is included in any traditional Jewish prayer book for perusal. It is traditional among observant Jews to study it in between Passover and what we call Shavuot, I think would be called Pentecost in English. And that every week you read it and study it. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of commentaries that have been done on it since it appeared. So of course I've got to do one also, because that's what you do when you're a rabbi. But here is a good example of the sort of approach that it has. It's sort of a series of maxims that appear to be simple, but then when you dig a little bit deeper into them and they begin to talk about character formation, you realize that they're not simple at all. This is one of the things that drives me crazy. They look like kind of homespun wisdom. You read it and you're like, duh. Who wouldn't think that? But then if you think about it a little bit, here it is. So here's one that is my favorite. This is from a vote. This is chapter 4, I suppose you could say verse 1, or what we would call Mishnah 1. Ben Zoma, who is one of the rabbis from around roughly 100 CE. And this is defining sort of some basic character virtues that are specifically important, right? Here's one. Who is wise? He who learns from every man, as it is said, from all who have taught me, have I gained understanding. So this is a standard way in which the rabbis operate. They're writing new stuff while pretending that all they're doing is working out the old stuff, which is always the way you do it. As a lawyer, of course, I love that, right? Oh, well, we're doing absolutely nothing new, he says, having transformed the law of the last 1,500 years, right? So here's this, well, okay, he who learns from every man, as it is said. But if you think about that for a moment, think about, first of all, just how hard that is and what exactly are you supposed to do with it. My teacher, Alan Morenis, who runs an organization called the Musar Institute. Musar is and we'll learn a little bit more about that, a tradition of Jewish ethical practices. He says, try one day to literally learn from everyone you meet and write it down. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. Oh, I go into the supermarket and I buy my granola. Here it is. Oh, make sure to put in the credit card. Oh, for some reason it doesn't work. Oh, don't worry about that. I can put that into the machine right now. Here you go. Would you like your receipt? No, that's fine. I can take it out of the supermarket. What did I learn in that exchange? It's actually not, you probably learned something, but you don't think about it. So if you were in the position of learning something, that's particularly hard. Who is mighty? Who is strong? He who subdues his evil inclination. And there's the line from Mishle, from Proverbs on this one. Jews do believe in the evil inclination. There is the famous rabbinic way of thinking about things is that everybody has a Yetzer HaTov, a good inclination, and a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination. Fine. But it's more complicated than that. So here's a good example, and I just want somebody to kick me or something if we're running out of time. There's a story in the Talmud about how the rabbis tricked the evil inclination and put it in prison. And they were very happy with themselves. We've been able to imprison the evil inclination. But then there was a problem. Nobody fathered children. Obviously, there's a sexual implication of that. Nobody went to work. Nobody did anything because there was no evil inclination anymore. And so they had to let it out. Okay, well then that means we need the evil inclination, but we also have to subdue the evil inclination. That's hard. How is that supposed to happen? How do you know that you're doing it the right way? So you think it's like, oh yes, of course we're supposed to subdue our evil inclination. Wait a minute, that opens up. It's the way I tell my students. It's like the world's biggest onion. Every time you've got a pattern of it, you're going to find more things that come into it. Well, this is one that my students get very upset about. Who is rich? He who rejoices in his lot, you shall be happy in the world. Well, okay, in one sense that's right. Constant attempt to acquire would be quite disturbing for someone. We know how acquisitiveness can destroy us. On the other hand, couldn't this be also a recipe for political quietism? Oh, I'm happy for my own lot. I will just do what I'm going to do. Well, okay, so what's the difference between the good kind of being satisfied and not the so good kind of being satisfied? So with all of these things, they are quick, laconic statements that if you push on them, it opens up an entire universe of of ethical discussion, which of course is the reason why everybody reads it. Here's another one. Well, actually, let me go forward because I want to make sure that Anthony has enough time. Okay. Here's one of my favorites, Rabban Gamliel, son of Yehuda HaNasi. Yehuda HaNasi, this means Rabbi Judah the Prince. The Nasi is the prince or the president. Used to say, do his will as though it were your will. So he will do your will as though it were his. Well, wait a minute. How does that work? Whose will are we in fact talking about here? If I do my will as that it was his, and so he would do his as if it were mine, who is whom in this way? It opens up a way of thinking about mysticism. You know, whose will are we talking about here? The 18th century Hasidic masters used to talk about the principle of bitul hayesh, which literally means the expunging of the self. Well, that's not simple. You know, I'll just go out on a limb and say that, right? So these are the kinds of texts that we work with in terms of being able to, establish a virtue ethics way of thinking about things.
I have the bill. Okay.
Oh, you got that. Okay.
I cheated. All right. So we're going to take a quick pivot then and now think about what are some of the ethical teachings and framings in the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll wrap by thinking together about what we're learning from virtue and analyzing these texts and thinking about what kind of instruction lessons we might draw from all of that. So, Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to assume this crowd is familiar. You've glanced at Matthew. If you haven't, keep your hand down. We'll talk about that in another context. Okay? One thing that I always want to emphasize again and again every single time is that we have to pay attention to the context of Matthew's gospel, the audience, when it's been written, for whom, why. My example that I use with my students a lot is imagine you heard me talking about my family. My mom is so annoying. My mom is so mean. My mom is so rude. And then when my students said, yeah, your mom is mean. And I would, exactly, I'd say, shut your mouth, that's my mom. Right? There's a way in which we're eavesdropping on a debate between family members, Jews fighting other Jews about who's the better Jew. Again, an ongoing tradition. Right, an ongoing tradition, exactly. And so we're listening in at the door, as I'm assuming primarily in this room, a large number of Gentiles. We have our ear against the door, we're listening in, and we're running away and saying, oh, here's what's going on. And we have no idea. So be careful. As these debates are going on, Matthew's emphasizing a number of things. The main theme I think we see in Matthew is the theme of righteousness, right? Of being just, of being set right, however you want to unpack or interpret that. And various related themes of authority, tradition, family, who's in, who's out, and then salvation for some and punishment for others. Blessedness with Abraham and his table for some folks, and weeping and gnashing of teeth for most everybody else. So, how does Jesus lay some of this out in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, you're all familiar with Matthew 5's beginnings and the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, they'll be comforted. On and on and on. Kind of a nice litany, a nice way of setting up the couple of chapters that follow. I want to draw your attention to a couple of points. First of all, Jesus is repetitive. Right? Keep saying, blessed are, blessed are. Maybe it makes him a good teacher. Sometimes you have to say things over and over again. But we should pay attention to what Jesus is saying when he says the word blessed, and some of the puzzles about why he's using that language and that wording. In Greek, it's makarioi. In Hebrew, people think it might be ashrei, some kind of form of being happy, being honored in some sort of way, exalted. Happy are, as some English translations put. But it's really unclear if Jesus is using this as a descriptive, a prescriptive, or some combination of the both. Descriptively, he might be saying, those who are poor, you are blessed. So even though you're poor, whatever's happening to you right now, if you're mourning, if you're sad, if you're being persecuted, you are blessed by God. You will inherit the earth. God has your back in the end for all of these things. But the question is this also prescriptive? In order to be blessed, do I need to be poor? Do I need to be mourning? Do I need to be persecuted? Or is it both? It's kind of a crazy, mixed-up tangle in some ways. When poverty comes because you aren't greedy, because you've given away all of your wealth and alms, because you've turned down the high-paying job that hurts the world to take the low-paying job that helps it, you're being described as somebody who's poor, but you're somebody who has chosen a kind of poverty, a kind of giving up. The reason I say this is ambiguous is because obviously if you emphasize the prescriptive too much, that seems to say that we should go and try and be poor, and it might lead us then to see the poor as somehow blessed in their poverty. Like, oh, I wish I could be as poor as you and be blessed, but I guess I'm not, right? And keep going along, right? And all the puzzles that generates. But Jesus' teaching doesn't solve these puzzles, it just sort of creates more of them for us. It forces us to kind of think about what kind of person is Jesus calling his followers to be in these various descriptions of people who are blessed or people who are happy. If we keep going a little further on, we have Jesus trying to describe himself in relationship to righteousness and relationship to tradition. Right? So if the Jewish tradition is one of commentary, of reflection, of debate and contestation, then Jesus is right in there, slotted in. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So most of my children's Bible stories tell them that Jesus was really nice and that other people, like Pharisees, weren't fair, you see. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount says Jesus was a hardline reader of the law. He intensified the law. If the idea is that part of what the Pharisees are doing is creating a hedge around the law, if they're taking the Torah and saying, the rule says this, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk or something like that, that we can usually avoid. Right? Don't normally accidentally put kids into milk and boil them, but you never know. So, right? And who knows what's going on at Pam's house when she's making dinner. You know, exactly, got to be careful. So let's make a bigger rule that says don't combine meat and dairy. Because if you do that, right, you're definitely not going to mix. And so that's part of what the Pharisees are doing. That's part of what all these rules and commentaries are doing. They're expanding the hedge, the fence, the border to keep you a little bit further away from danger. Okay? Jesus pushes the border out further. The hedge becomes larger, not smaller. He says, you've heard it said in ancient times, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't divorce, bear false witness, yada, yada, yada. He says, actually, let me put this up to 11. Right, let me just crank this up a little bit for you. Now, the Christian, and particularly the Protestant Lutheran variety of interpretation, usually runs with, well, Jesus is showing us how much we need forgiveness and showing us how much we can't accomplish. And that is an interpretation, but biblical scholars will say that doesn't seem to be quite what Jesus is saying in his context, at least here in Matthew. Maybe Paul says that. Maybe Luke and John dabble in those waters, but Matthew seems to be saying something a little bit differently about the expectations for righteousness, for purity, for mercy, for forgiveness of his community. Additionally, there are parts where Jesus seems to be turning up the pressure where there doesn't even need to be pressure turned up. So he says in 5:43, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Scholars of the ancient Mediterranean, of Judaism, will say, where is he getting that from? That's not written down anywhere. Nobody else records that as a thing. And so we're left with a puzzle. Certainly, Jesus wants to emphasize the importance of loving your enemy. And what that means seems just as hard as figuring out what's going on in the supermarket with every person I'm talking to. Who's my enemy? Are they really my enemy? Am I my own enemy? Right? You can kind of keep spiraling down that one for a while. But part of the question here as well for our relationship to our Jewish siblings is, if there's something here ascribed to a different party they didn't say, that might be a problem, right? Like if I said, people who work at Carlton like to say that Olis are stupid, but I would never say that about them. Right? You notice a problem, hopefully. So Matthew has this recording of Jesus saying, don't do a thing that the other people are doing, that they're saying, we weren't even doing that. What are you talking about? And that creates issues for how we interpret Jewish ethics and our Jewish siblings in all kinds of ways. If we see them as inherently geared towards loving only the lovable and hating their enemies, that's wrong for all kinds of reasons, right? Okay.
So we were going to try, what do we have? We have what, about 12 minutes? 13 minutes. So we were going to try to talk about this in the context of dealing with hot-button political issues. Oh, thank you. Thank you. My students often say that my voice is too loud, so then I try to not have, you can't win. So we're talking about this in the context of sort of a hot-button political issue. And the first exercise we wanted to do is to say, we've got a list here of a whole bunch of virtues from two different traditions, from the Jewish and the Christian tradition. I mentioned to you about the Musar tradition, and there are a whole series of virtues which in the Musar tradition are known as midot, which literally means measures. And we were thinking about, well, what would you do in terms of virtue ethics, which is supposed to be personal ethical conduct within the context of a public sphere? So Anthony and I were talking about this through, and he said, I know, if I can put this on, why don't we do this all to talk about Gaza? Now, as a rabbi, let me tell you, probably the thing that I want to talk about least is the Middle East. Waterboarding, Chinese water torture, below that, talk about the Middle East. But you kind of have to. So the exercise we wanted to do for the next 11 or 12 minutes is to have you talk amongst yourselves, correct me if I'm wrong on this one, and take a look at this, not what you think about the conflict, but rather what virtues might appeal to you and be important when you are trying to figure out first your position on the conflict and how you might communicate about the conflict. In other words, I'm going to say that neither Judaism nor Christianity are going to be geopolitical thinkers or philosophies, although there are all implications, but in terms of ethics, they're very important. So what are the things that actually matter in terms of beginning to come to think about a hot-button political issue? And this is what the rabbis would, in the Talmud, would call a kal vachomer, which is really more of a kind of a fortiori reference. If you can implement virtues when dealing with this issue, you can do it with anything. So we just wanted to leave it to you for 10 or 11 minutes, and then when we come back afterwards, we can talk a little bit more about how this is supposed to work. What are the virtues that are important in dealing with this conflict, and how would they manifest themselves for you when you're approaching it? So in the words of Saturday Night Live character, talk amongst yourselves.
It's good. It's good. Are there any extra copies laying around? Any extras? 2-minute warning, 2-minute warning. We're going to call you back together. We realize we gave you a long list and not a lot of time, but that's what we do. Are there any folks who'd like to share sort of what the virtue you or your neighbors zeroed in on during your discussion?
So we kind of came to the four of us came to realize that understanding of
Okay.
All right, the four of us came to realize that understanding and humility were closely related, right? And truth is somewhere in between. And also you need to have moderation as well.
Oh, good, good. So we're about being excessive in some sort of way, and yeah, moderation, humility.
It's been my experience that these virtues work really well among ordinary people, but there's a fourth kind of virtue or ethics, and that is if I can get by with it, it's ethical. And we are experiencing that in this country, politically, and I think one could explain what goes on in the Middle East for the same reasons. It's about power and money. And those who are in power positions and are greedy use that fourth ethic.
Yeah.
If I can get by with it, it's ethical.
Yes. Which, just to follow that up, would be a way they live their lives, but not one we would call ethical, or at least I wouldn't call ethical. Right? Just like, yes, using the wooden end of the hammer to pound a nail isn't using a hammer well or rightly. Yeah. It's close.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Having led a number of student groups to the Middle East at various points, the times when we found a little bit of understanding is when we sat down and discussed and exchanged views between the Muslims, the Jews, and Christians living in that area. And it turns out that if you've led a St. Olaf program to the Middle East in the last 30 or 40 years, most of the students come back strongly biased against these Israeli government.
Well, I'm not going to, honestly, I don't think that we need to be in the position of taking a position on the conflict, but rather, what are the ways in which you as individuals would approach your engagement with the issue? Right, that's...
You're doing discussion between the various people in the area and from our particular background as single people coming into this area.
It's really fun, just so
Way to go. Yeah. Just to say, I like underlining understanding. Understanding doesn't lead to necessarily agreement, but it might lead to a better appreciation for what somebody cares about, where they're coming from, what their situation is, things you have or haven't thought about. And so we don't need agreement, but understanding seems good.
And well, it's 10:35, so the hook is coming here. I apologize for that. But we're going to continue this conversation and make it even more complicated after lunch, and then we're going to fix everything, both in terms of your own personal virtue in the Middle East and everything. So it's going to be worth your time. So thank you for your attentiveness right now. Thank you for the opportunity, and in the words of my former governor, Mr. Schwarzenegger, we'll be back.
Yes.
And if you didn't hear the invitation before, if you didn't RSVP for lunch, please still come this afternoon. Just let the other people eat first.